Hello and welcome to a podcast of the Turkey program at the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, LIAMEP. My name is Ioannis Grigoriadis. I'm a senior fellow and the head of the Turkey program at the LIAMEP, and also I'm associate professor at Jean Monnet Chair European Studies at Bilkent University in Turkey. I'm very happy to host today in this podcast series Professor Dimitris Tsarouhas. Professor Tsarouhas is a colleague of ours at the LIAMEP. He's also a senior fellow at the Turkey program, but he's also a director of the Turkey program at the Center for European Union Transatlantic Studies in Virginia Tech. He's also a fellow at Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Dimitris has recently authored a paper on the Turkish economy. The Turkish economy is always a very interesting and controversial topic to discuss, but Dimitris' angle is interesting. His paper is entitled Turkey's Green Transformation and the CBAM. This acronym starts for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So it refers to how the climate change and the transformation of the global economy and the new needs that green transition brings forward is going to affect Turkish economy. Turkey is a country with a lot of exposure to climate change, and Dimitris is going to discuss this with us today. And of course, its linkage to the European economy and the European policies on climate change also brings new obligations for Turkey and new challenges for the Turkish economy to address. This discussion will be the first part of our podcast. In the second part of our podcast, we'll have the opportunity to discuss with Dimitris, who's a major expert on Turkish economy. We'll have a discussion on the current outlook of Turkish economy, which is always attracting a lot of media and policy experts' attention, given the fact that the Turkish economy has always been a bellwether for Turkish politics. So, Dimitri, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ioannis. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for hosting me.
Turkey is not normally remembered when we talk about green power, green energy transition, but your paper exposes a lot of policy initiatives that have been taken in recent years on this. Can you tell us a few more things about what is happening in Turkish economy with regards to green transition?
Sure. Thank you again for having me, and thank you for offering the opportunity to discuss what I think is going to be an issue that is, as you noted, not currently discussed as much, but is likely to become more important, especially given that the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the European Union, which was voted into law last year in 2023, is going to come into effect latest by January 1st, 2026, and which is going to have, I think, important effects in terms of things like the trade balance, not to speak of the composition of the products that is going to be exchanged within the single market, and which the European Union is going to sort of import from outside it, in a way, an attempt to create some kind of a level playing field, given the fact that, as you noted before, what the EU is trying to do is combine the so-called green agenda, acutely aware of the challenge that climate change brings about, particularly in countries like ours in the Mediterranean basin, but also beyond it for EU states. But at the same time, combine this with the acute need to maintain economic competitiveness and improve the functioning of the single market. Because as you know, for Europe, the big challenge now is to finally move ahead with a well-functioning single market, not only for industrial goods and products, but also for things like digital services. So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is basically trying to do, I think, both things at the same time, the green agenda and economic growth. And this is where countries like Turkey come in, Ioannis, because what you're looking at here, of course, is the major export and import partners of the European Union. You can be rest assured that the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism provisions may, as you rightly noted, not be as much discussed at the moment in policymaking circles in Ankara or elsewhere, but they're very much keenly observed in countries like China and India, and also the United States, that constitute major trade partners of Europe. So for a country like Turkey, the big challenge here is to continue with the, if I may say, baby steps that the government has started to take in recent years in an attempt to try and align its legislative framework and its policy framework with the kind of requirements that a large part of the international community wants emerging market economies to comply with. And this has to do with things like the 2015 Paris Agreement, the introduction of net zero goals, and so on. And in the paper, what I'm outlining is indeed those steps that the Turkish government started taking. We should note that they are very recent. So we have really had something that amounts to a bit of a U-turn in Turkish policy on climate change and environmental protection only in 2021. So we're talking about something very recent. And yet, I would argue also something pretty real. Now they decided to sign up to Paris, the Paris Agreement. The Turkish government, at the same time, has committed to a net zero goal, which is 2053 in their case. And there is an attempt to try and deal with the actual cost imposed on the Turkish economy by the intensive use of carbon and high number of carbon emissions. So they are embarking on that agenda, and I think that there is more to come in that direction, given that the issue is acquiring more importance, both for economic reasons and also because, as you know, civil society in Turkey too is raising awareness about the deleterious effects of climate change in the country.
Thank you very much. Let me also add that Turkey is one of the countries of the Mediterranean where everybody in the field recognizes to be a climate change hotspot. Like the Mediterranean is going to face disproportionately strong effects, negative effects because of climate change compared to other parts of the world. So in that respect, it is understandable that the Turkish government takes these initiatives. But as you have already said, these initiatives came a bit late. Turkey used to have second thoughts about ratifying the Paris Agreement. At some point, it followed a discourse arguing that climate change has happened because of the developed world, and Turkey is not part of the developed world. Turkey needs to develop, and then therefore it needs to pollute in order to reach the development level of Western countries. But as you said, now there's a different discussion, and possibly the Turkish civil society has played a role in that respect. But I understand that also, given the structure of the Turkish economy, the steps that need to be taken are very, very big. Turkey's dependency on hydrocarbons, imports of natural gas, which of course has its own political consequences, the origin of natural gas, right? It's be it Russia or be it Azerbaijan or other countries, or crude oil. This brings forward another discussion. So does this mean that Turkey is investing on renewable energy sources in order to meet these needs? And is this investment sufficient for these goals to be met? Or is this yet another lofty statement that is not going to be met, as very often is the case with climate change statements by many countries around the world? Turkey is not alone in this, I'm afraid.
I think that's a great point that you raise here, and I think there are two things that need to be mentioned. The first is a large part, I think, of the government's U-turn on this should be placed in the wider context of its attempt to repair relations with the West, because as I outlined in the paper, a large part of this attempt to transition towards a more sustainable pattern of economic growth, you're right that the current one has been based very much on a carbon-intensive economic model. So the attempt to try and move away from it is basically happening through both signing up to major international agreements, but also crucially relying on Western financial aid in moving towards the clean energy transition. I discuss, for instance, in the paper how you have now bilateral loans from donors like Germany and France to the tune of about $3 billion for the domestic clean energy transition in Turkey. Within the government's new Green Deal action plan, there are specific quantitative targets, but they are also part of another agreement with the World Bank this time, worth $1 billion to expand the country's solar energy capacity, and also to introduce a pilot program to start the process of battery storage, so that they can actually create a sort of economies of scale that will allow this to become sustainable. So you're right, they don't have a good track record. Many governments have been moving back and forth on this issue of committing themselves to the transition. And it's still early days. We don't know whether Turkey will do this in the way that some envisage, but it's definitely worth seeing. Now, the second thing worth mentioning about this is capacity, right? So to what extent does, regardless of sort of governmental commitment, to what extent does an economy, which is obviously largely comprising the private sector, to what extent is it ready to commit the capital and to expect to reap the rewards of such a transition? And in the paper, what I'm trying to discuss is that we have some evidence that there are larger Turkish companies that have the capacity both to recognize the problem. They tend to be pretty sophisticated in the way that they function. Remember that Turkey has a private sector that is comprising certain very large firms, which are, of course, very actively engaged in European and global supply chains. And so some of those firms are now making the transition through their internal workings, through international agreements, etc. But the overall picture is that adaptation will take a lot of time, and you need to raise awareness to a larger extent than today to actually make it successful. So yes, you have governmental commitments, part of a wider network of attempts to try and repair economic ties with the Western world. This is how I see it. But at the same time, you have major deficiencies in making sure that both your public administration is now more aligned with this idea of the challenge that the carbon border adjustment mechanism, for instance, will introduce, and also the myriads of smaller firms within the Turkish private sector that follow a very unsustainable economic model. And to convince them to change it is going to be extremely difficult.
No, I see your point, and I very much agree with it. Let me also point to what you said in the beginning, that this U-turn also signals the realization of a fact on the side of the Turkish government that regardless all the ambitions about Turkey playing a global role or Turkey joining the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Turkish economy remains firmly connected with the European economy and the Western economies at large. In that respect, Turkey has to comply with certain norms and certain rules that will enable the access of Turkish firms to these very important economies for them. So Turkish exports are mainly directed towards the West, and anything that may affect the exports of Turkey towards these markets is going to be a big issue. And I think that this decision makes this very, very clear. On the other hand, I would like to raise a question based on what you said in towards the end, that this is going to be an expensive and difficult transition. Given the current state of Turkish economy, which is characterized by the keyword stagflation, right? Turkish growth has not recovered, although interest rates have gone very high, ending a very unconventional, unorthodox monetary policy by the Turkish government that lasted for years. So we've been witnessing this in the last year, that Turkey has moved back to a more orthodox monetary policy, but we don't see the results yet. So how difficult will it be for the Turkish government and the Turkish companies to follow this costly transition as promised?
It's a good question, of course, and it's difficult to estimate how things will move forward because, as you said, we are pretty much used to the idea of, the Turkish government making some abrupt U-turns when it seems to be politically expedient to do so. Now, having said that, I would be very hesitant to characterize the Turkish situation as one beset by stagflation. I mean, the actual growth rates of the Turkish economy are, by international standards, quite impressive. I think what is more important than that is obviously the very big inflationary pressure that the Turkish economy suffers under. And I don't see how this is going to change, at the very least, until the beginning of 2025, maybe mid-2025, when things are expected to calm down a bit. The biggest challenge, Yanis, I think, is one of a structural character. It hasn't got to do so much with looking at macroeconomic indicators, but it has to do with strategic decision-making on the part of the state. Maybe the state becoming what some colleagues like Mariana Mazzucato have called the entrepreneurial state. I mean, Turkey can make that transition, and it has certain advantages in making it, as I try to outline in the paper. Its relative standing on things like the green complexity potential, for instance, so-called GCP, has improved markedly over the last few years. It has certain capacities and, again, economies of scale on things like fuel energy or wind turbine components, which other economies in the region don't. So they have the potential. The point is, how much does the Turkish state seriously want to invest in the long term on things like hydrogen technology? The capital for this can be found. I don't think it's a question of economic necessity. The question is, can you do so whilst attracting private sector capital, which is going to invest in the long run? Because remember, this transition, this is why countries in Europe and in the United States and in China and around the world have problems with. This is a very long-term game, right? So there are hardly any electoral benefits attached to it. There are long-term environmental and economic opportunities if you do this correctly. So I don't think that the current inflationary pressures that Turkey is facing are the big issue. The biggest issue is the structural composition of the economy, the fact that the construction sector, for instance, accounts for most of that growth that I mentioned earlier, and especially, of course, the composition of the construction sector and the way in which this carbon-intensive industry has been allowed to grow to an extent reminiscent of other emerging market economies that creates wider imbalances in the economic model followed. So I think they can do this. I believe that emerging market economies have certain advantages which are particularly important. As you rightly pointed, however, they will be quite careful, and I think Turkey wants to negotiate with the European Union on things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, because, you know, there are certain estimates, which again I outline in the paper, that suggest a rather hefty price tag on the sort of adjustment necessary, the penalties, so to speak, in effect, the penalties that the Turkish industry will have to pay if it wants to continue with this sort of, customs union originating trade relationship with the EU.
Thank you very much. You pointed in your answer also to one of the biggest problems that students of Turkish politics try to understand, which is the institutional capacity and the vicissitudes of institutional capacity in Turkey, whether the Turkish state, the Turkish government is able to address the multiple challenges that the society and the economy is facing. And of course, monetary policy has been a very hot discussion topic in that respect, because it referred to the independence of the central bank, the willingness of the presidency to impose its views on monetary policy on the central bank. And in my opinion, this has been an issue in the last crisis that hit upon the Turkish economy. In the last year or two, we have a new minister of economics who came with perceived support of the international markets, aiming to bring about a more orthodox, more predictable monetary and economic policy. So nevertheless, there is a lot of discussion right now in Turkey about this monetary and economic policy, exactly because of the fact that inflation hasn't fallen as many had expected. How would these discussions, like about a possible change in the administration of the ministry or of a new U-turn on Turkish economic policy, which is going to be initiated by the president, how big can be the effect of these possible changes on our discussion topic? So is Turkish policy on green transition immune from this, or is it likely to fall victim to yet another U-turn of the presidency?
I think that what has occurred over the last few months, this speculation about the future of the finance minister in the Turkish cabinet, is not so much linked to our discussion on the so-called green transition, but it has more to do with what is very obvious in Turkey. I had the chance to visit the country in the summer, namely the complete and utter disappointment with the policy followed. I think you put it very mildly and very diplomatically when you said that inflation hasn't dropped as much as expected. Most people simply cannot make ends meet in Turkey. And there is also this perception fueled by television and social media images of lavish luxury by ministers, that the finance minister in particular, Mr. Şimşek, is pretty much out of touch with Turkish society. So I think that the sort of political calculation behind the possible replacement of the minister is more linked to that, the perception of being out of touch and maybe an attempt by the president in the future to correct that perception, rather than the long-term structural changes that are required in the Turkish economy to make that transition possible. Because, as I mentioned before, I think that a lot of the work that has been done in the Turkish economy in the last couple of years has really been an attempt to repair economic ties with the West, because they were worried that things were getting out of hand. But it wasn't really about changing the country's economic model. And let's be clear, changing an economic model is always very difficult, and it always takes a lot of time. There was some speculation, Yanis, as I'm sure you recall, a few years back, about this issue, whether Turkey was adopting what was called something like the Chinese model, or some were talking about other models. None of these things happened. Turkey didn't change its model. Turkey basically, in my own opinion, has downsized economic expectations, and it has created a vast swathe of salaried employees that basically work for the minimum wage, which has had important consequences in terms of things like wage and income distribution, which has then fueled the current feeling of despair that large masses of Turkey's society experience. And therefore, the answer to your question would be no, in the sense that for that green transition to happen, and to happen, effectively and successfully, you would need to have a very different starting point. You will need to listen a lot more to what the long-term institutional investors in the country and abroad are looking for, in terms of transparency, in terms of a stable set of legislative rules, in terms of public sector investment, things which are missing from the Turkey's conversation for quite some time.
Thank you very much. As we're reaching the end of our conversation, I have one last question on the opposition in Turkey. What is the position of the chief opposition party on these issues? Are we having a consensus, or are they going to promote a more greener policy, or are they going to defend the interests of the sectors that are facing difficulty in adjusting to the new green economy?
It's a great question, Yanis, because they have kept rather mute on this issue, haven't they? There hasn't been much, as we mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, there hasn't been much public debate, let alone intra-party debate, as the extent to which the environmental challenge is necessitating a particular policy stance. I think that's very unfortunate, because, as you again mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, Turkey has been suffering heavily, as have so many other countries around the world, from the consequences of climate change. And the idea that this is a strictly environmental issue and should be dealt with by making sure, for instance, that Canal Istanbul doesn't move ahead, which is, one of the things that the opposition has promised, this could be seen as endorsing a so-called green agenda, yet we know that this is far from being an ambitious long-term plan of how you can adapt to the requirements of the new environmental challenge at the same time as you enhance your economic competitiveness. I don't think that the opposition, to put it frank, has bought into the idea that you can combine both. And they tend to see things in a very compartmentalized sort of fashion. The green transition is for the people interested in green issues. I think there's a missed opportunity here for the political class in general. Again, not only in Turkey, but around the world, because those issues are intimately intertwined, and they will pose the greatest challenge for societal cohesion particularly in vulnerable states, in years to come. So the opposition is not ready yet. They've organized a whole series of demonstrations and public meetings over the summer on so-called bread and butter issues, from agricultural produce to the price of energy. But they have yet to get deeper on this issue. And I think, just like you, I also wonder whether they will before the next election.
This brings us to the end of our conversation. Dimitri, I would like to thank you very much for this very interesting discussion on a topic that definitely deserves more attention than the public in Turkey, Greece, and Europe is devoting. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank our audience as well. And please stay tuned for more podcasts from the Turkey program on issues related to Turkey and its region.
Thank you, Ioannis. Thank you so much.